They say money makes people do unthinkable things. I watched my daughter-in-law smile while slowly poisoning my diabetic service dog. She wanted the insurance payout. She didn't know I'd already embedded RFID tags in every training pellet 6 months earlier. GPS logged, time-stamped. Her betrayal was perfectly mapped. I let her file the claim. Then I showed her the footage. My name is Gerald Harwood. Kessler was my 8-year-old diabetic alert Labrador, trained to sense my blood sugar crashes before I could feel them. He'd saved my life more times than any human. And 6 months before my daughter-in-law started shoving sugar-soaked treats into his mouth, I'd already tagged every last pellet with a micro RFID chip for a behavioral study I was running in my spare time. GPS logged, dose logged, irrefutable. She thought she was collecting on a pet life insurance policy. She didn't realize the evidence was already inside the dog, and I was just waiting for the claim to settle before I tore that family apart with a spreadsheet. I am, by training, a systems engineer. 37 years with Lockheed Martin, the last 12 spent designing fault-tolerant avionics for aircraft where a single uncaught error kills everyone on board. I don't believe in coincidence. I believe in data, and when the data doesn't line up with the official story, I believe the data. Kessler was never just a dog. I lost my wife, Marion, to ovarian cancer 7 years ago, and my own type 1 diabetes chose that exact window to stop cooperating. My blood sugar would plummet without warning. Twice I seized in the night. My son Mitchell found me once, blue-lipped on the kitchen floor. After that, he and his then-fiancée, Elaine, insisted I apply for a medical alert dog. Kessler arrived at 18 months old, already fully trained, a Labrador with eyes the color of dark maple syrup and a nose that could smell a glucose crash 10 minutes before my continuous monitor even twitched. I paid nothing for him. The nonprofit covered the placement, but I insured him immediately. The replacement cost of a fully trained diabetic alert dog runs upwards of $40,000, and I wasn't about to lose him to a car accident or a sudden illness with nothing to show for it but another grave. The policy, with Companion Shield Pet Insurance, paid out $45,000 on death from accident or illness, with premiums subsidized because Kessler was a working service animal. Now here is a fact about pet life insurance that most people don't know. The payout goes to the named beneficiary, just like a human policy. I listed Mitchell as primary, Elaine as secondary, reasoning that if I went first and Kessler needed care, they'd have the resources to look after him. It seemed like a sensible arrangement. I didn't think about it again for nearly 5 years. The RFID project started entirely by accident. 6 years ago, I joined a citizen science initiative out of the University of Michigan's Canine Cognition Lab. They were recruiting retired engineers with dogs to help them study long-term memory encoding through object tracking. The idea was elegantly simple. Embed a passive RFID microchip, roughly the size of a grain of long-grain rice, inside a compressed food pellet. No battery, no signal until it passed within 18 inches of the scanner I kept beside the treat jar. The scanner would then log the chip's unique ID, a GPS coordinate from my paired phone, and an exact timestamp. I'd sit with Kessler every evening after his walk, feed him 2 of those pellets from the designated jar, and the data would upload automatically to the lab's server. Over months, they built a map of when and where he'd eaten certain treats, correlating with behavioral cues. It was fastidious, borderline obsessive work, and I loved every moment of it. I even started making my own pellets in the basement with a second-hand compression mold, embedding a fresh chip at the center of each one. By last fall, I had a log stretching back 18 months, every treat consumed by Kessler accounted for with forensic precision. Elaine entered the picture differently. She married Mitchell 4 years ago, a small ceremony at the Botanical Gardens. She was charming, a former pharmaceutical sales rep with a smile that arrived before anything else, and if you've spent any time reading people, you know what that usually means. I was polite, kept my distance. She called me Papa Gerald from the first month, which I found subtly presumptuous but never said so. She liked to bring Kessler organic supplements for his coat, little brown bottles that I quietly threw away. She talked a lot about holistic pet care, raw diets, and casually about how expensive everything was these days. Mitchell had a good job in commercial real estate, but Elaine seemed perpetually dissatisfied with their income. She wanted a bigger house, a better car, a second vacation home. I smiled and nodded and filed it away. The first time Kessler got sick was a Tuesday morning in early February. He vomited twice in the backyard, refused his breakfast, and lay listlessly on his bed while my glucose monitor started beeping. I was crashing and he hadn't moved to alert me. I drove us to the emergency vet myself, one hand on the wheel and one eye on my CGM. Blood work came back with something I did not expect. His glucose was dangerously high, nearly 300 milligrams per deciliter, and his amylase and lipase levels suggested acute pancreatitis. The vet, a sharp young woman named Dr. Alston, asked me if Kessler had gotten into something, garbage, chocolate, anything with a high sugar or fat content. I said no, absolutely not. He's on a strict diet, I told her. I weigh his food myself. She gave us anti-nausea medication and a warning. Pancreatitis can recur, and if it becomes chronic, I might lose him. I went home, sat in my study, and stared at the wall for a long hour. Then I opened the treat log on my computer. What I found rearranged my entire understanding of the last several months. The RFID data showed that Kessler had consumed, in addition to his regular 2 pellets each evening, additional pellets on 17 separate occasions over the previous 90 days. Each extra ingestion event carried a timestamp that fell squarely inside the hours when I was out of the house: grocery runs, medical appointments, my Wednesday bridge club. And every single one of those timestamps sat within 30 minutes of my security system, recording the front door being opened with the code I'd given only to Mitchell, Elaine, and the cleaning service. I pulled up the cleaning service's schedule and cross-referenced it. They came every other Thursday. The extra pellets fell on Tuesdays, on Fridays, on Sundays, days when Elaine had taken to stopping by just to check on you, Papa Gerald. She had a key code, a smile, and seemingly infinite affection for my dog. And now I had a spreadsheet suggesting that every time she came alone, an unlogged treat, or rather, a treat I had not authorized and did not give, ended up inside my dog. The treat jar was the key. I went to the kitchen and opened it. The pellets inside looked identical to the ones I'd made in the basement, but when I counted them, the math didn't add up. I'd restocked 80 pellets 6 weeks earlier. With Kessler eating 2 per day, I should have had roughly 38 left. There were 21. Someone had been feeding him extra treats from that jar, treats that, because they were all chipped, left a digital receipt every single time. I tested one myself, cracking it open with a pocket knife. The RFID chip glinted in the lamplight. No sugar inside, just the standard low-fat formulation. But then I went back to the logs and looked closer. 6 of the extra ingestion events were immediately preceded by a 9-second pause, the exact amount of time it would take to remove a pellet from the jar, inject a sugar solution into it with a small syringe, and offer it to the dog. I know this because I timed myself doing it, just to be sure. Elaine didn't know about the chips. Why would she? My citizen science project was an eccentric old man's hobby, barely worth mentioning at dinner. She walked into my kitchen a dozen times, opened that jar, and fed Kessler something she'd tampered with, never once suspecting that the treat itself was a tracking device. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my study, the glow of the monitor on my face, and reconstructed the pattern. The dates, the GPS coordinates confirming the treats were consumed inside my home, the exact correlation with Kessler's subsequent illnesses. Then I pulled up the Companion Shield portal and checked the policy status. Still active. Beneficiary unchanged. No claim had been filed, but Kessler was getting sicker, and I now knew exactly why. I could have called the police right then. I had the evidence, or at least enough to raise serious questions. But I didn't, Because if Elaine was willing to slowly kill a service dog for money, then she had a plan that was bigger than a few sugar-soaked pellets. She was waiting for Kessler to die in a way that looked natural: pancreatitis, complications from age, maybe a final crisis while I was out of the house. And then the claim would land on the insurance company's desk with a grieving widow's perfect composure. She'd already started, and I realized with a coldness that surprised even me that I was going to let her finish the first move before I ended the game. I poured myself a whiskey, called Dr. Alston, and told her that Kessler would need a very specific set of blood panels going forward, panels I wanted copied directly to me, personally, by law. Then I logged every remaining treat in my safe, installed a hidden camera with a view of the kitchen counter, and waited. 3 weeks later, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed with an automated alert from Companion Shield. A claim had been submitted for Kessler Harwood. Cause of death: acute pancreatitis, secondary to age-related organ failure. The claimant was Elaine Mercer Harwood. Kessler was not dead. He was alive and sleeping peacefully on his orthopedic bed in my study, his glucose perfectly stable, his pancreas still recovering from the last assault but nowhere near failure. Companion Shield had been told otherwise, and that falsehood, that single, provable lie on a legal insurance document, was the kind of mistake that turned a shove into a fall off a cliff. I sat at my desk, staring at the claim notification on my phone, and felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger. Not yet. This was colder than anger. This was the same feeling I used to get in the avionics lab when a failure tree suddenly made sense, when all the disparate warning lights resolved into a single, coherent failure mode that you could trace with your finger straight back to the source. I had spent 37 years designing systems that could not fail, and Elaine had just introduced herself as the failure point in a system I understood better than anyone. The first thing I did was call Mitchell. Not to accuse. I needed to know what he knew, and I needed to know it before Elaine had a chance to spin the narrative. He answered on the third ring, voice thick with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been told his father's beloved dog is dead and has been grieving accordingly. "Dad," he said, and the word came out cracked at the edges. "I am so sorry. I came over as soon as Elaine told me. The vet said it must have been fast." I let the silence sit for a beat. Then I said very calmly, "Mitchie, Kessler is fine. He's right here next to me, wagging his tail. I just gave him his evening treat." The silence that followed was the longest I have ever shared with my son. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something I didn't recognize. "What do you mean, he's fine?" "Elaine said she found him. She said she took him to the vet herself. She said Dr. Alston called the time of death." "Elaine has never spoken to Dr. Alston," I said. "I confirmed that 20 minutes ago when I called the clinic myself. Dr. Alston has no record of treating Kessler in the past 2 weeks. There is no death certificate. There is no cremation authorization. What there is, Mitchell, is a life insurance claim for $45,000 filed against a dog who is currently licking his paw on my study floor." I heard him exhale, a long, unsteady breath. Then I heard something else, the sound of a man sitting down heavily on a surface that wasn't quite ready to hold his weight. "Dad," he said, "tell me everything." I did. I told him about the RFID pellets, the abnormal treat logs, the timestamps that aligned perfectly with Elaine's solo visits. I told him about the hidden camera I'd installed 3 weeks ago, which had captured her on Tuesday afternoon removing 2 pellets from the jar, injecting them with a clear solution from a small syringe she kept in her purse, and feeding them to Kessler by hand while cooing to him about what a good boy he was. I told him about the blood work Dr. Alston had sent directly to me, which showed Kessler's glucose spiking to dangerous levels within hours of those visits, and then normalizing, repeatedly, in a pattern that made no biological sense unless someone was deliberately poisoning him. Mitchell listened without interrupting, When I finished, there was another long silence. Then he said simply, "I didn't know. I swear to you, Dad, I didn't know any of this." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. Mitchell had his faults. He was too trusting, too eager to see the good in people, but he was not a conspirator. He was a man who had married a predator and hadn't yet figured out what was on the other side of the smile. "Where is she now?" I asked. "She's at home. She's been crying all evening. She told me the vet handled everything, that Kessler's remains were already being cremated." "And the claim," I said. "Did she mention the claim?" He paused. "She said something about paperwork. She said I shouldn't worry about it. She'd handle it." "Of course she would," I said, "because Elaine has been handling everything, hasn't she? The vet visits, the supplements, the emergency that happened while I was at Bridge Club. She has been handling my dog's slow death for months, and you have been kept just far enough away to miss it every single time." Mitchell made a sound I had never heard from him before. It was somewhere between a sob and a growl, the noise of a man whose entire understanding of his marriage was dissolving in real time. "What do we do, Dad? Do we call the police?" "We could," I said. "I have more than enough for an arrest. Animal cruelty, insurance fraud, forgery, those are felony charges, and the claim she filed is a federal offense because it crossed state lines. Companion Shield is incorporated in Delaware. We're in Michigan. That's wire fraud, and the Postal Inspection Service doesn't play games." "But here's the thing, Mitchell. If we call the police now, she gets arrested, she gets a lawyer, and she spends the next 2 years tying this up in court while the insurance company freezes the claim and we all look at each other in depositions. She might even walk. You know how these cases go. A pretty white woman, no priors, maybe she cries on the stand and says it was a misunderstanding. And Kessler's still alive, which makes the fraud harder to prove because there's no actual corpse. She'll argue it was a clerical error, a mix-up at the vet's office, anything her attorney can dream up. We'll spend $50,000 in legal fees to recover 45, and she'll be back on Instagram posting about healing journeys before the ink dries." Mitchell was quiet again. Then he said very low, "You have a different way." "I do," I said, "but it's not a phone conversation. Come over tomorrow morning. Come alone. And bring me everything you have from your joint accounts, every statement, every credit card, everything she's touched financially in the last 12 months, because I need to understand the full scope of what she's been doing, and I need you to understand it too." He agreed. We hung up. I sat in the dark with my dog breathing softly at my feet and thought about what I hadn't told my son yet, the part that was going to hurt him the most. The next morning, Mitchell arrived at 7:30, carrying a banker's box full of financial documents. He looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed and his hands were shaking slightly, the way hands shake when the body has been running on adrenaline for too many hours and is starting to run out. I made us coffee, real coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table like we used to when he was a teenager, and I was teaching him how to balance a checkbook. Only this time, the stakes were not a $20 overdraft fee. We spent 4 hours going through those documents. What we found rebuilt the case entirely. Elaine Mercer Harwood was not just poisoning a dog for an insurance payout. She had been systematically draining the household accounts for nearly 2 years. Small amounts at first, $100 here, $200 there, always masked as medical copays or vet bills or household expenses that Mitchell, in his trusting exhaustion, had never questioned. But the pattern was unmistakable once you laid it out on a calendar. Every single withdrawal corresponded to a shopping spree, a spa visit, a weekend trip to Chicago that she'd told Mitchell was paid for with points. She had opened 3 credit cards in her maiden name, run up balances totaling $43,000, and was using the joint account to make minimum payments without Mitchell knowing. And on top of all of that, she had taken out a separate pet insurance policy on Kessler with a different company, a smaller one based in Florida, for an additional $15,000, listing herself as the sole beneficiary on both. She stood to collect $60,000 when Kessler died. Not a fortune, but enough to clear her credit card debt and have a tidy little cushion left over. Enough to look like an accident and not a motive. Enough to be worth killing a dog for. Mitchell stared at the spreadsheets I'd assembled. His face was pale, his jaw working silently. She was going to let me believe Kessler died naturally, he said. She was going to hand me an urn full of someone else's ashes and cash the check and never tell me. Yes, I said, and if I hadn't chipped those treats, she would have gotten away with it. I let that sink in for a moment. Then I stood up and walked to my study and came back with a folder I hadn't shown him yet. Inside were screenshots from the hidden camera footage. Bank records Elaine had clearly never expected anyone to cross-reference, and a letter from Companion Shield's fraud investigation unit, which I had called that morning before Mitchell arrived. I had spoken to a woman named Patricia Nkosi, a senior fraud investigator who had been with the company for 11 years and who had listened to my preliminary summary with the focused intensity of someone who recognized solid evidence when she heard it. Ms. Nkosi had told me two things that changed the calculus entirely. First, Companion Shield maintains a database of all claims filed across their entire policy network, and if Elaine had filed a false claim, she would be flagged permanently. Not just with them, with every major pet insurer in the country, because they share fraud data through an industry consortium. Second, and more importantly, Companion Shield had a policy of pursuing criminal prosecution in every confirmed fraud case, no exceptions, full cooperation with state and federal authorities. They didn't want settlements. They wanted convictions. It was a deterrent strategy, and according to Ms. Nkosi, it worked. Mr. Harwood, she had said, her voice carrying the precise, untheatrical authority of someone who has testified in court many times, if you can provide me with documentary evidence that this claim was filed against a living animal with intent to defraud, I will open a formal investigation immediately. And I should tell you that in my 11 years, I have never lost a case where the insured was caught falsifying a death. I told her I would have everything to her within 48 hours. She gave me her direct line. I wrote it down on a piece of paper and placed it neatly inside the folder. Mitchell read through everything. When he looked up, his expression had shifted. The grief was still there, raw and unprocessed, but underneath it was something harder, something I recognized. "Dad," he said, "what do you need me to do?" I leaned back in my chair, looked at my son, my trusting, kind, broken-hearted son, and told him the part I hadn't wanted to say over the phone. "I need you to not confront her," I said. "Not yet. I need you to go home and act like nothing has changed. You're grieving. You're sad. You're grateful she's handling the arrangements. You don't know anything about the claim. You don't know anything about the second policy. You're just a husband who lost a beloved family pet." He looked at me like I'd asked him to swallow glass. "Dad, I can't look at her." "You can," I said, "because she thinks she's already won. She thinks the claim is processing, the dog is gone, and her grieving husband is too checked out to notice the money that's about to land in the account. She's relaxed, she's confident, and a confident opponent makes mistakes you can bank." I paused, then I told him about the next move. "Companion Shield is going to open an investigation," I said, "but they're not going to contact Elaine first. They're going to contact the vet clinic to verify the death. And when they find out there's no death certificate, no treatment record, no cremation, when they find out Kessler is still alive and under the care of the same veterinarian who has been monitoring him for 6 years, they're going to freeze the claim. Quietly. Legally. They're going to send a letter to the beneficiary asking for additional documentation, proof of death, vet records, a signed statement from the attending physician. And Elaine won't be able to provide any of it," I continued, "because none of it exists. She forged a death that never happened, and the only records that exist are the ones I have. The RFID logs, the video footage, the bloodwork panels showing glucose spikes that correspond exactly to her visits. She built her entire fraud on the assumption that Kessler would actually die, and when he didn't, She filed the claim anyway, hoping no one would check. Mitchell was starting to see it now. The color was coming back into his face. So she gets caught in the lie, he said. The insurance company denies the claim, but that's not enough for you. No, I said, it's not. Because if Companion Shield denies the claim and walks away, Elaine learns a very dangerous lesson. She got caught, but nothing happened to her. She'll try again. Maybe not with Kessler, maybe with something else, someone else. I leaned forward and put my hand on the folder. This is what I told you I was building toward. The insurance claim denial is just the trigger. Once Companion Shield officially flags her for fraud, I have everything I need to go to the county prosecutor. Animal cruelty is a felony in Michigan. Insurance fraud over $10,000 is a felony anywhere. And wire fraud is a federal charge that the U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't need me to ask twice about. I want her to see it coming, Mitchell. I want her to open that denial letter and realize, in the space of about 5 seconds, that she has been walking into a trap someone dug months before she even thought she was hunting. I want her to know that the old man she dismissed as a doddering retiree with a dead wife and a diabetic dog was, in fact, the only person in the room who understood the entire game. Mitchell was silent for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, she's going to lose everything. Yes, I said, but I need you to understand something. This is going to be public. It's going to be embarrassing. Your wife is going to be arrested. Your name is going to be in the news. You didn't do anything wrong, but you're going to feel like you did because that's how shame works. It attaches to proximity. He nodded slowly. I've been married to a stranger for 4 years, Dad. I think the shame has already attached. I reached across the table and put my hand on his. Your mother would be proud of you, I said. And then I handed him a copy of the Companion Shield fraud report and told him the exact date and time I planned to pull the trigger. The next morning, I called Patricia Nkosi back and gave her the full package: video timestamps, RFID logs, blood work, GPS coordinates, and a sworn statement from Dr. Alston confirming that Kessler was alive, under her care, and had never been treated for any terminal event. I also included a screenshot of the second insurance policy from Florida. Ms. Nkosi was quiet for approximately 30 seconds. Then she said, Mr. Harwood, I've been doing this for 11 years, and this is the most thoroughly documented fraud attempt I have ever seen. I'm opening the investigation now. The denial letter will go out by certified mail within 5 business days, and I'm required to notify the state insurance commissioner's office, which will trigger a criminal referral. I thanked her, hung up, and walked out to my garden. Kessler was lying in the sun, tail thumping gently against the grass. I sat down beside him and scratched behind his ears and thought about what was coming. Elaine had filed the claim on a Thursday. The denial would arrive on a Tuesday. And on that Tuesday, she would discover that the quiet old man with the diabetic service dog had just handed her a map to her own courtroom, drawn entirely in data she never knew existed. The 5 days between my call to Patricia Nkosi and the arrival of the certified letter were the quietest I have ever spent inside my own home. I went about my routines, watered the tomatoes, walked Kessler along the creek, attended my Wednesday bridge club, smiled at the neighbors. But underneath the ordinary surface, I was running a parallel operation with the same clinical attention I used to give to pre-flight avionics checks. I had a clock in my head and a folder on my desk that grew thicker by the day. Mitchell checked in every evening from his car, always parked a few blocks from his house, voice low. Elaine was acting oddly cheerful, he reported, bringing him dinner, asking about funeral arrangements for a dog whose body didn't exist, talking about maybe getting away for a weekend to grieve. She was waiting for the insurance payout. He didn't know which of the 2 policies she expected to hit first. I asked him to look for the Florida policy documents. He found them 2 days later, hidden in a file folder labeled Home Warranty in her office filing cabinet. The policy had been active for over a year. She had been planning Kessler's death before his first pancreatitis episode ever appeared on a vet chart. But here is the thing about building a case against someone who thinks they are the smartest person in the room. They never plan for the moment when their victim becomes the investigator. Elaine had been so busy constructing the illusion of a grieving daughter-in-law that she missed the fact that her father-in-law had spent a career in threat analysis. I started to look at her the way I used to look at a malfunctioning navigation system. What is this failure trying to tell me about the deeper architecture? On Saturday, I got my answer. I was cross-referencing her credit card records against her known movements when I noticed a recurring charge I didn't recognize. $19.95 a month, billed to Wellness Partners Administrative Services. I searched the name and found a small life insurance brokerage based in Reno, Nevada. They specialized in high-risk policies for seniors, people over 70, often with medical conditions. The kind of policy you buy when you expect a payout sooner rather than later. I called them. I told them I was Gerald Harwood and I was calling to confirm the status of my policy. The agent on the line paused, checked the system and said, "Mr. Harwood, I show one active policy in your name, taken out in March of last year, with Elaine Mercer Harwood listed as sole beneficiary. The face value is $250,000. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat in the quiet of my study and let the magnitude of what she was trying to do settle over me. Kessler was never the main target. The dog was the small score, the $60,000 that would clear her credit cards and buy her a year of breathing room. The real money was on me. $250,000, payable on my death, with my daughter-in-law as the only person who would see a cent. And I now had a piece of paper that proved she had taken this policy out without my knowledge, without my consent, and just months before Kessler started getting sick. I realized in that moment that Elaine was not just poisoning my dog to collect on an insurance policy. She was rehearsing. She was testing her methods on an animal that couldn't speak, seeing how far she could push the glucose levels, how long it took for the vet to notice, how cleanly a death could be made to look like an age-related complication. Kessler was her pilot program. I was the final deployment. I called Mitchell, not the usual evening check-in. This was an emergency summons. He arrived within the hour, pale and sweating, expecting to hear that she had found out that the plan had collapsed. Instead, I handed him the life insurance document. He read it again. His hands started to shake so badly that he had to set the paper down on the table. $250,000, he whispered. She insured you without telling anyone. She insured me for $250,000, I said. And the only thing standing between her and that payout is a man with type 1 diabetes who was already having unexplained health episodes before Kessler arrived. Look at the timeline, Mitchell. Look at it. He saw it. 6 months before Kessler's first pancreatitis attack, Elaine had taken out this policy. And 2 months before that, I had spent a week in the hospital with a severe hypoglycemic episode that came on without warning. I had assumed it was my diabetes getting harder to manage in my late 70s. Now I wasn't so sure. I went back to my medical records and found what I was looking for: blood work from that hospital stay that showed, buried in the metabolic panel, an elevated level of a synthetic insulin analog that was not my prescribed medication. It had been flagged by the lab as an anomaly, but the attending physician had chalked it up to a pharmacy mix-up. No one had investigated further. I pulled the date of admission and cross-referenced it with Elaine's visits. She had been at my house the night before, bringing me a get-well casserole. I want you to pause for a moment and understand what I was piecing together. My daughter-in-law had been slowly, deliberately, and systematically trying to kill me. Not with a gun, not with a dramatic confrontation, with the quiet, patient tools of a former pharmaceutical sales rep who knew exactly how insulin worked, who had access to my home, and who understood that an elderly diabetic man dying of a hypoglycemic crash would attract no more suspicion than a frozen pipe in winter. She was going to cash in on my death the same way she planned to cash in on my dog's, with a neatly filed insurance claim and tears at the funeral. and I had just tipped my hand. The insurance fraud investigation on Kessler was going to trigger a review of all her policies. Once Companion Shield flagged her for fraud, the industry consortium would light up, and every insurer she had ever done business with would start pulling files. The life insurance policy would surface. The second pet policy would surface, and the pattern would become impossible to ignore. But there was a problem. If Elaine learned about the investigation before the authorities were ready to move, she could destroy evidence, flee the jurisdiction, or, worst case, accelerate whatever plan she had for me. I needed the investigation to proceed quietly, and I needed to keep her calm and unsuspecting until the moment the trap closed completely. Mitchell wanted to leave the house that night, to take his things and come stay with me and never look at her again. I told him no. Not yet. He had to stay exactly where he was, play the grieving husband, and for the next few days treat his wife with the same exhausted, sad affection he had been showing all week. He had to let her believe the insurance money was about to land. He had to keep her comfortable. Because on Tuesday, she was going to receive a certified letter from Companion Shield, and the second she opened it, she was going to realize that the entire architecture of her plan had been built on sand, and I needed to know exactly what she did next. Monday morning, I drove to the county prosecutor's office. I had called ahead and requested a meeting with the Felony Crimes Division, and by 11 o'clock, I was sitting across from Assistant Prosecutor Maria DeLuca, a compact woman in her early 50s with the kind of eyes that don't miss anything. I laid out the evidence in order: the RFID logs, the hidden camera footage, the blood work, the second pet policy, the life insurance policy she'd taken out on me, and my medical records showing the anomalous insulin analog. I gave her Patricia Nkosi's contact information at Companion Shield and told her the denial letter was going out the next day. Assistant Prosecutor DeLuca listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. "Mr. Harwood," she said, "in 26 years of prosecuting fraud and elder abuse cases, I have never seen a victim walk in with this level of documentation. Usually, I'm the one telling families that they don't have enough evidence to proceed. You have given me a case that could go to trial tomorrow." I told her I wasn't interested in a plea deal. I wanted full prosecution, animal cruelty, insurance fraud, attempted murder. Because if Elaine was willing to murder me for $250,000, she was willing to do it to someone else. She was a danger, and the only thing that stops a predator permanently is a conviction. DeLuca nodded. She said she would coordinate with the Insurance Commissioner's Office and the U.S. Attorney's Wire Fraud Division. She would have arrest warrants prepared within 48 hours of the denial letter landing, and she advised me to stay out of the house when the arrest went down, not for my safety, but for the integrity of the case. I agreed. I had no desire to watch Elaine being handcuffed on my son's front lawn. I just wanted it to happen. That evening, I sat on my back porch with Kessler laying across my feet, and I called my son one last time before the storm. I told him about the meeting with the prosecutor. I told him the arrest was coming, probably by the end of the week, maybe sooner if Elaine tried to flee. I told him to pack a bag and leave it in his trunk, just in case he needed to get out fast. And I told him that when this was over, when the legal machinery had ground through its process, and Elaine was sitting in a courtroom facing the consequences of what she had done, I would be there in the front row, and he would be sitting next to me. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Dad, how did you not fall apart when you realized she was coming for you?" I considered the question. Because I spent 37 years in a job where falling apart meant people died, I said. And the one lesson I learned, the one thing that never failed me, is that data doesn't panic. Data doesn't get scared. Data just waits for someone to read it correctly. And I did. Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear. I got up at 6, fed Kessler his unchipped breakfast, made myself oatmeal, and waited. At exactly 9:43 a.m., the Companion Shield tracking system updated. The certified letter had been delivered. By 9:45, I received a text from Patricia Nkosi. Letter delivered. Fraud flag active. State notified. Criminal referral transmitted. I opened the app that monitored my home security system. At 9:52, Elaine's car pulled into my driveway. She had come to check on Papa Gerald one last time. She didn't know the letter was already in her mailbox back home. She didn't know that the moment she stepped through my door, the final phase of the operation was already in motion. I was sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in, all smiles and sympathy and the practiced warmth of someone who has spent years being whoever the room needed her to be. "Papa Gerald," she said, "I brought you some soup. I've been so worried about you." I looked up at her. I looked at the Tupperware in her hands. I thought about the synthetic insulin, about the sugar she had injected into my dog's treats, about the $250,000 policy she had taken out on my life. And I said, very calmly, "Sit down, Elaine. We need to talk about Kessler." She froze. Just for a half second, the mask slipped and I saw something underneath. Not guilt, not yet. Calculation. The rapid, silent assessment of a predator realizing the prey has turned around. "He was such a good boy," she said, recovering smoothly. "I know how much you miss him." "He's not dead," I said. "He's in the study." The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might fall. She looked toward the study door, then back at me, then toward the door again. "What do you mean?" I stood up and walked to the study and opened the door. Kessler padded out, tail wagging, fully alive, and walked directly to his food bowl without so much as a glance at the woman who had been trying to kill him. I turned back to Elaine. "The treats you've been feeding him for the past 3 months," I said, "were embedded with RFID tracking chips. Every single one. I know when you gave them to him. I know what you injected into them. I have it on video, I have it in blood work, and as of 9:43 this morning, I have a formal fraud investigation open with Companion Shield. They know Kessler is alive. They know you filed a death claim, and they have referred the case for criminal prosecution." Elaine's mouth opened. No sound came out. She was staring at the dog like she was seeing a ghost, and in a sense she was, the ghost of a plan that had just collapsed around her. But I wasn't finished. "And Elaine," I said, picking up the life insurance document from the table and holding it so she could see. $250,000 on my life, without my consent. The prosecutor has this too. So when you walk out of this house, you should know that the next person who comes to your door will be wearing a badge, and they will not be bringing soup." The silence in that kitchen was the longest I have ever heard. And then she bolted for the door, and I let her go, because I knew the trap she was running into was already set, that the clock was ticking down to the moment when everything she had built on my death would become the foundation of her undoing. I did not watch her leave. I stayed at the kitchen table, my hands flat on the wood, Kessler now lying at my feet with his head on his paws. The front door slammed. An engine turned over too fast, and gravel spat against the undercarriage of her sedan as she reversed out of my driveway. I counted the seconds in my head. 10 seconds for her to reach the stop sign at the end of the street. Another 15 to decide which way to turn. By the time she was out of the subdivision, Patricia Nkosi's fraud flag had already propagated through the insurance consortium database. Every policy she had ever touched now had a glowing red marker next to her name. I picked up my phone and dialed Assistant Prosecutor DeLuca. "She just left my house," I said. "She knows the claim is blown. She knows about the video. She doesn't yet know I found the life insurance policy, but she will within the hour." DeLuca's voice was steady. "We have the warrants ready. I'm sending a team to her residence now. If she goes home to destroy evidence, she'll walk into them. If she runs, we'll pick her up on the interstate. Mr. Harwood, you should stay exactly where you are. I'll call you when it's done." I hung up and looked down at Kessler. He thumped his tail twice, the signal he used when my blood sugar was fine and everything was normal. Nothing about this day was normal, but Kessler had no way of knowing that. To him, It was just a morning with the man who fed him, and the woman who had been poisoning him had finally stopped coming around. I sat there for nearly 3 hours. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't check the news. I just waited, the way I had waited in the lab years ago for a flight test telemetry to come back clean, patient, certain, watching a silent screen that would eventually light up with confirmation. At 12:27 p.m., my phone rang. It was Mitchell. "She's in custody," he said. He was breathing hard, but his voice was clear. "They arrested her at the house. She came back, Dad. She came back and started throwing things into a suitcase, and the police were already waiting. She tried to tell them it was a misunderstanding, that you were a confused old man who didn't know what he was talking about. Then they showed her the certified letter. Then they showed her the screenshot of the life insurance policy. She stopped talking." "Where are you now?" I asked. "Sitting on the front steps," he said. "They're still inside. Crime scene unit, I think. They took her computer, her phone, the file cabinet. A detective asked me if I wanted to press additional charges for the financial stuff. I said yes." I closed my eyes and felt something in my chest release. Not relief exactly. Relief was too simple. It was the quiet confirmation that the system I had set in motion had worked exactly as designed, and that my son, however shattered, had just made the hardest decision of his life without hesitating. "I'm coming over," I said. "I'll bring Kessler." "Dad, is that okay? I mean, he's supposed to be dead." "Kessler is evidence," I said, "and evidence gets to go for a car ride." When I arrived at Mitchell's house, the police were finishing up. A young officer tried to tell me that pets weren't allowed near the scene, but his supervisor, a sergeant with gray hair and a weary expression, noticed Kessler's service vest and waved us through. I found Mitchell sitting on the living room sofa, elbows on his knees, staring at the carpet. Kessler walked directly to him and placed his head on his lap without being asked. Mitchell buried his face in the dog's neck and cried. Later that afternoon, I finally got the full picture from DeLuca. The search of the house had turned up more than I expected, and what I expected was already substantial. In Elaine's office, behind a false back in her filing cabinet, investigators had found a spiral-bound notebook. Not a diary, a research journal. Page after page of meticulous notes detailing Kessler's reactions to different doses of simple sugar solution, insulin, and one compound I didn't recognize that the lab later identified as a carbose, a diabetes medication that slows carbohydrate absorption. She had been running a controlled experiment on my dog, adjusting her poison formula over months, charting the exact glucose spike and recovery time for each combination. And on the last page of that notebook, dated just 3 weeks ago, she had written 4 words in careful block letters: "Ready for Phase 2. Phase 2, we now understand, was me. The synthetic insulin she had begun administering to me in food, in drink, possibly in the lip balm she once insisted I try because your lips look so dry, Papa Gerald. The life insurance policy on me had a 2-year contestability clause. She had taken it out 19 months ago. She was waiting for the clause to expire so the payout would be uncontestable. And in the meantime, she was perfecting the method on a living dog who couldn't report her to the police. Let me tell you something about the law that I learned in the months that followed. Animal cruelty in Michigan is a felony punishable by up to 4 years in prison. Insurance fraud over $10,000 is a felony punishable by up to 14 years. Attempted murder, even by slow poisoning, carries a potential life sentence. And when you add interstate wire fraud to the charges, because the insurance company is headquartered in Delaware, and the victim lives in Michigan, and the fraudulent claim traveled across state lines through the Postal Service, you have also invited the federal government to the party. The U.S. Attorney's Office does not need an engraved invitation. Elaine Mercer Harwood was charged with 17 felonies. The list took the court clerk nearly 4 minutes to read aloud at her arraignment. I was present for that hearing, seated in the second row between Mitchell and a victim advocate from the county. Elaine looked smaller than I remembered, the charm stripped away, the smile absent. She wore an orange jumpsuit and her hands were cuffed in front of her. When her eyes found Mitchell's face, she opened her mouth as if to speak, and Mitchell simply turned away. She took a plea deal eventually. Not out of remorse, I never once saw evidence of genuine remorse, but because the evidence was so overwhelming that even her defense attorney told her she was looking at a life sentence if she went to trial. She pled guilty to 1 count of insurance fraud, 1 count of felony animal cruelty, and 1 count of elder abuse with intent to cause serious harm. The elder abuse charge was the one DeLuca had fought hardest for, because it acknowledged what I had been trying to tell people from the beginning. This was not a crime against a dog. This was a crime against an old man, and the dog was simply the canary in the coal mine. She was sentenced to 22 years. The judge, a woman named Honorable Cynthia Okonkwo, looked directly at Elaine as she delivered the sentence and said, "You used your access to a vulnerable elderly man and an innocent animal to engineer a financial gain. The only reason no one died is because your intended victim was, remarkably, more competent than you are. The court will not allow you to try again." The Florida insurance company voided the second policy and opened their own investigation, which would have resulted in additional charges if she hadn't already been sentenced. Companion Shield sent me a letter thanking me for my cooperation and informing me that, as a result of this case, they had changed their fraud detection protocols to flag any policy where the beneficiary was not the primary owner of the animal. Small comfort, but I took it. Mitchell filed for divorce within the month. The proceedings were swift and uncontested because Elaine was in the Oakland County Jail and had no way to fight them. He sold the house, moved into a small apartment closer to me, and started seeing a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma. I asked him once, about 6 months after the sentencing, whether he blamed himself for any of it. He thought for a long moment. Then he said, "I blame myself for not looking harder. But I don't blame myself for what she did. That's hers." I took that as progress. Kessler was examined by 3 veterinarians, including a specialist at Michigan State's Veterinary Teaching Hospital. The damage to his pancreas was real but not irreversible. With a strict diet, careful monitoring, and absolutely no sugar-laced treats from anyone ever again, his function improved steadily. Dr. Alston called me one Tuesday afternoon with lab results that showed his enzyme levels had returned to normal range. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in my study with my dog breathing softly beside me and let myself feel, for the first time in nearly a year, something like peace. I retired from the Citizen Science Project a few months later, not because I lost interest, but because I had gotten everything I needed from it. The database I had built, the thousands of time-stamped entries, the meticulous record of every pellet and every walk and every wagging tail, it had served its purpose. I wrote a thank you letter to the University of Michigan lab, explaining in general terms that the project had helped me with a personal matter, and I donated the remaining RFID pellets to their archive. Now, I want to close a loop that I suspect has been sitting in the back of your mind for this entire story. You may have wondered, as I did, what would have happened if Elaine had succeeded. If Kessler had died from the pancreatitis, if no one had noticed the RFID chips, if the claim had been paid, and the life insurance policy had matured, and I had suffered a fatal hypoglycemic episode that looked exactly like an unfortunate accident. The answer is that she would have gotten away with it. Completely and permanently. She would have collected $310,000 in total payouts, $60,000 for the dog, $250,000 for me, paid off her debts, and disappeared into a new life with no criminal record and no one left alive to ask questions. And here is the surprising detail that I only learned after the arrest. It turned out that Elaine had done this before. Not the murder part. We found no evidence of a prior death, but the insurance fraud pattern. 7 years earlier, she had been a sales rep in Ohio, and a former colleague of hers came forward after seeing the news coverage of the arrest. This colleague reported that Elaine had bragged at a company retreat about finding a loophole in a pet insurance policy she'd taken out on a cat. The cat had died under ambiguous circumstances, the claim was paid, and Elaine had laughed about it over drinks. No one had followed up. The cat was old, the policy was small, and the veterinarian had signed off on natural causes. There was no investigation, no flag, no record. She had simply learned that the system was easier to beat than anyone wanted to admit, and she had spent the next 7 years refining her technique. The detective assigned to my case called me after they confirmed this. He said, "Mr. Harwood, the only reason we caught her this time is because you were running an experiment she didn't know about. If you hadn't chipped those treats, she might still be sitting at your dinner table." I thanked him and hung up and went outside to water my tomatoes. The sun was setting over Beckley, the same soft orange light that had fallen across my garden every evening for more than 30 years. Kessler was lying in his usual spot, tail sweeping slow arcs through the grass. I thought about the cat in Ohio, dead for 7 years with no one left to mourn her but an insurance adjuster who never looked hard enough. I thought about the version of this story where I was the one in the ground, and my son was left with an urn of ashes, and a wife he didn't know was a predator. And I thought about what it means to live in a world where cruelty is patient, where it sits across the dinner table and asks if you want more soup, where it looks exactly like kindness until the moment it doesn't. Some people adopt service dogs because they need help managing a medical condition. I adopted Kessler for the same reason, but I kept him alive because I had spent a lifetime learning that the difference between disaster and survival is almost never bravery. It's documentation. It's patience. It's the willingness to look at a row of numbers on a screen and trust what they're telling you instead of what you want to believe. She thought she was poisoning a dog. She was actually feeding evidence to a tracking system she never even knew existed. And in the end, the only thing that stood between Elaine Mercer Harwood and $250,000 was a Labrador retriever who absolutely refused to die, and an old man who had been recording every single bite. Here is the thing I have come to understand about betrayal. It rarely arrives with a knife. It comes with a casserole. It comes with a bag of organic dog treats and a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. It comes from the people you gave a key to your front door because you believed, genuinely and without suspicion, that they were safe. And the scariest part, the part I still think about when I sit on my porch in the evening with Kessler breathing softly at my feet, is that most people never find out. They get sick and they assume it's age. They lose a beloved animal and they assume it's nature taking its course. They cash a check that's slightly smaller than it should be, and they never know someone else's signature was forged on the back. I am not special. I am just a man who happened to be running a scientific study with RFID tags at the exact moment a predator decided to test her method on my dog. That is luck dressed up as intelligence. But here is what I did that wasn't luck. I looked at the data when it didn't look right, and I trusted what it was telling me instead of what I wanted to believe. That's a muscle anyone can build. And in a world where the Elaines of the world are patient, methodical, and hiding in plain sight, it is the only muscle that might save you. I still wear the old flannel shirts, though I have upgraded my garden clogs. Kessler's pancreas is stable. Mitchell comes over for dinner every Sunday, and we talk about anything except the year his wife tried to murder both of us. That will come, I think, when he's ready. For now, we just eat and watch the dog chase squirrels. It is a quiet life. I prefer it that way. Some people ask me if I regret not calling the police the moment I found the first suspicious treat log. I don't. If I had moved too quickly, she would have found a way out, some legal loophole, some missing piece of evidence, the benefit of the doubt afforded to pretty young women with no prior record. Instead, I let her commit the crime in full, on camera, in data, in blood work, until the case was so airtight that her own lawyer couldn't find a crack. Not every victim has the luxury of time, but if you do, use it. Build the file. Let them talk. And when you finally move so completely that they never get a second chance. If this story has stayed with you, do us one quick favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. Most people never do, but it's what keeps these stories coming. And whether you're dealing with a family betrayal, a quiet threat you can't quite name, or just a dog who deserves to be protected, I hope you remember what Kessler taught me. Sometimes the smallest piece of evidence, the tiniest chip of information buried inside an ordinary moment, is the only thing that will ever stand between you and the people who think you're too old, too slow, and too trusting to notice. Stay sharp. And thank you for being a part of this sphere.